Buenas noches. Agradecemos a todos su asistencia y participación en el conversatorio ¿Es la ansiedad una enfermedad? Hoy el presentador es Peter Van Dausen, fundador de Brain Trainer Internacional, quien tiene más de 50 años de experiencia trabajando con el cerebro. Y ya vamos a dar inicio. Si tienen preguntas, pueden dejarlas en el panel que se encuentra al lado derecho de sus pantallas y estas serán respondidas al final de la presentación de Peter. Nuevamente, bienvenidos para todos. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you very much. Well, we decided tonight to talk about anxiety because that is at present of the issues that we think about as being mental health problems. It's the most common one, the one that affects the most people in the world. So let's talk a little bit about anxiety and particularly what it is, whether it's really a pathology or just a habit that our brains develop, and how we can recognize it in someone's brain and how we can train it. So I know that we're in the middle of what we all have been told is a pandemic because there are people getting sick with the COVID virus around the world, but they're probably somewhere in the vicinity of 5% of the people who've died from the COVID virus, of the people who've gotten the COVID virus have died from it. And most of those, as you probably know, are people who are over 70 or over 80. And most of the people have also had other problems, other health problems that made them more vulnerable. But anxiety strikes everyone. And it kills people because, as we know, people commit suicide, or they drive badly, or they do other things that damage themselves. So let's talk a little bit about the pandemic of anxiety. Essentially, anxiety is a feeling of fear, a feeling of discomfort that we get when we are in a situation where we cannot control the things that we want to control. For that reason, what we'll see is that before the pandemic, before the COVID, about 20% of the people in the United States, I haven't found information about all over the world, but people in the United States, 20% of them who were over 18 had what they considered an anxiety disorder. Since the lockdown, since all of us have had to stay home and not touch each other and stay 2 meters apart and not go to work and all of those things, that number has risen to almost 60%. 6 out of every 10 people in the United States are anxious to a point where it interferes with the way that they're able to work and live. So that's a situation which is caused by the fact, in many cases, that people are afraid that they might get sick. People are afraid that they might die. Of course, those things can happen every day, any day. But in many cases, it's because they don't know if they're going to have a job. They don't know if they'll be able to keep their small business open. They don't know if they'll have money to pay the bills, because we're in the middle of something that we've never done before. And there doesn't seem to be a very good reason for it, but we're doing it. So it puts us in a situation where we cannot figure out what the future is going to be. There's no way for us to know how the world is going to change in the next month or in the next 2 months. Even simple things like, will children be able to go back to school? Will children be held out of school? If they go to school, will they have to wear masks and gloves and stay 2 meters apart all the time? Will our jobs come back? Will businesses open again? All of those things are unknown. There are some places where the decision has already been made in July that nothing will reopen until the end of August, even though we know that the number of deaths is going down very strongly. There are other places where literally schools will not open in the United States this whole year, all the way to December. So it becomes very difficult to know what you can count on, what you can expect. It's difficult to plan, and that creates anxiety. That's very good for the drug companies. So in the United States, worldwide, this is the market for anti-anxiety drugs is over $6 billion a year, every year, and it's going up every year. And I'm sure it's gone up a lot since the lockdown. But there are another whole set of drugs for people who don't go to doctors when they are anxious. They find drugs that they're not supposed to be using. The crisis in the United States and in some other areas with opioid drugs, which are killing many people and destroying the lives of many people, that's a $30 billion a year business. And the same companies make these drugs that make anti-anxiety drugs. Just that you can get these from any doctor, you can get these from some doctors, or you can get them from other people besides doctors illegally. So when we look at this data, one of the things that you find is that people who tell us about this tell us a lot about what are the causes of this anxiety. What causes anxiety? Why is it so strong throughout our countries in the world? Well, these causes are all outside our control, the way they're expressed. And when you talk to people about stress or about anxiety, they will often say, oh, yes, I'm very stressed by my work, or I'm very stressed by my husband, or I'm very stressed by something. Nothing to do with me. It's coming from the outside. So the level of stress that we work under is in many cases related to the economic situation that either the whole world is in or that my family is in. Many people who are retired and had plans to be comfortably retired, have money to take care of themselves and be able to travel a little bit and things like that, are now seeing that that money is going away. There's nothing they can do because stock markets are crashing and businesses are going away. So that's an issue for the cause of economic stress. If someone had a job, was able to pay for the family's food and their home and everything, and then suddenly lost the job and wasn't able to work for 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, their family is in an economic difficult situation. And then social issues, all of the crazy stuff that's going on in the United States and in other parts of the world where there are riots and people are burning things, not because of COVID, not because of being locked down, but because all of a sudden they've decided that the place that they live is a terrible place and they need to change it. The speed of technological change is something which many people talk about, you know, how much you can do with a computer now. For people who are not comfortable with computers, that's stressful because they can't even figure out how to turn the computer on, but other people are doing all kinds of weird things with it. And then one of the things that's a major issue is that the media that we have in most countries, I'm not sure about all of the South American countries, but in most countries, like in the United States, the media speaks with one voice. People who don't say the same thing, who don't say, no, the COVID is very deadly. No, it's going to kill us all. No, we all have to stay inside. No, we all have to wear masks. No, we can't touch each other. If you don't say that, if you have facts that present a different point of view, you're simply not allowed to speak. So all of the news doesn't talk about any of the other things that are going on in the world. It only talks about COVID or about the riots. So since that's the only thing you hear, if you watch TV, and the only thing you hear in most cases, if you go on social media, you get the view that that is the whole world. And that's very stressful. So what I'm going to talk about here is something a little bit different, which is to say, it's always great to blame something outside of ourselves. But in fact, we know that almost none of those things and most of the things that people say they're stressed by, we can't really control. In fact, as you'll see in the next slide, I think that's my definition of stress. So I wanted to go back and look and see what are some of the things that we can control in our own lives that have really changed, not just in the past 4 months, but have changed in my country, at least, over a period of years that have made us all more anxious. One of the things that keeps you from being anxious is faith in some kind of a spiritual connection with something outside of yourself. So if I believe that there is a God and that God cares about me, and if I maintain contact with that experience of God, then I'm not as likely to be terribly anxious because I have a strong center. I have a place that I can say, okay, I can trust this. Right now, for most people, especially younger people who believe that their religions are crazy, that there is no supreme being or any of that kind of stuff, the supreme being for those people is a big corporation. Google is God. Facebook is God. Or the government is God, because it has the ability to take money away from us, to allow us to work, not allow us to work, make us go to war, all kinds of things like that. So we have supreme beings, but our supreme beings aren't really connected to us in a in a spiritual way. They're not spiritual items. They're commercial or some other kind of being. So that's something which has changed. And what I see is that many of the older people that I know who grew up at a time when there was a willingness to think about something bigger than me, but that was also a part of me, or I was a part of it, who have that sense of their own connection to something bigger. Those people are not as anxious as the younger people who say, oh no, there's no such thing. Media and social media, if this is our new religion, these are our scriptures. And instead of scriptures that we have from whatever religion we used to belong to, or whether you belong to a religion or not, the scriptures that talk about spiritual things, meditation and things like that, those are primarily positive. What we have are almost entirely negative. The media is not interested in good stories. They're interested in bad stories because they think that's what people like. Social media, the good stories are, here is a cute kitten or a cute puppy, but the main thing is these people are bad, those people are bad, this thing is bad, and so forth. When I grew up, I'm 70 something, 73, I'm too old even to remember anymore. I grew up on a small farm. It wasn't really a farm, but it was a fair amount of land. We had our own woodlot. We had orchards of apples. We had stream and lots of property. And I used to love to go out into the woods by myself, find a place where I could sit in a tree that had a very comfortable sort of seat built into the roots of it, right beside the stream, and just sit there absolutely quiet and just listen. And I didn't have anything playing music in my head. I didn't have a cell phone with me. I didn't have any of those things. It was just me and nature. And after I sat there for a while, pretty soon the birds and the animals would begin to recognize that I was very quiet. I was not moving. And so they began to move around more comfortably, come closer. And it was just a beautiful place to be. And I got in touch through that experience with a kind of stillness within me. And that is the stillness that I talk about when I talk about the spiritual. We even when we pray or we meditate. In prayer, for example, I always say there are several things that you do in prayer. One of those is you say thank you for all of the good things that you've received. In many cases now, if you talk to people about what's good in their lives, there really isn't anything. It's all bad. And then you say, gee, I did these things that I wish I had not done. I'm not proud of. I'm sorry for those things. And then we say, I ask for these gifts, these blessings for myself, for my friends, for my family, for the whole world. And after we've done those things, then ideally we shut up, we stop talking, and we just listen to see if God has anything to say to us. As long as you have, rap music in your head, it doesn't matter. God's not going to be able to get through that. As long as you're always watching a movie or playing back a video or talking to somebody online or reading through your messages to see how many new friends you have and so forth, you don't have that stillness. And when you find that stillness within yourself, then you experience that there is something else in you, not your thinking, not what you do, not how much you have, but something else that connects you to the animals, to the birds, to the plants, to other people, whether you like those people or don't like those people. So our culture does everything it can to keep us from feeling that quiet, that peacefulness. In terms of relationships, personal intimacy is another way that we used to, and hopefully many of us still do, understand that there is something in me that can connect to something in another person at a very deep level. A person who, I love my wife very much, but there are things about her that I would say, gee, if I could change that, I would. But I don't expect her to change that because it's a part of her. And I'm sure she says the same thing about me. But I still love her and I can still connect with her at a very deep level, more than most people. For some of us, we have friends that are like that. But now friends are people that we're on Facebook with or on Instagram or whatever. People in many cases we've never even met. And all we know about them is that they believe this and they don't like that and they like something else, and that they have certain points of view. There's no intimacy, there's no connection there. And even people who are seeking to find a partner like that are doing now what we call online dating or speed dating, where you meet with a bunch of other people very quickly and you judge them. Yes, no, 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 yes, no, no, yes, yes, no, no, no. Not interested, not interested, based on what I saw, a very quick exterior impression. And I never get a chance to actually talk to those people, learn about them, have them learn about me. It's all about making a connection, buying a car, whatever, those kinds of connections. Also, some of you probably are not old enough to really have a sense of this, but when I went to school, we learned about history. And I remember still many of the things that I learned in school, and I still am interested when I find someone who talks to me about history, someone who tells me about what happened in the past and how we dealt with situations in the past. But what I find now in the United States, what happened with all of the with all of the riots, people went around pulling down statues because they said, we don't want history. We don't care about it. When we look at these people and judge these people from 1800 or 1700 or 1600, people who were very important in the time that they lived, maybe they didn't act like we would act now. Maybe they didn't believe all the things that we believe now, but they were very important people. And we can learn from them today, but we don't want to. We don't want to know about the past. Everything is only in the present. And that then allows us, it keeps us from having perspective. It keeps us from being able to say, okay, so this has happened 2 times before in history, 3 times before in history, and I know how it came out. Or I can even remember 5 years ago when something happened, and I see how we dealt with it at that time, and I have some idea of whether that was a good idea or a bad idea. So I have a better chance of not worrying too much about it because I have the ability to put it in perspective. Right now, what seems to be, at least in a significant number of people in my culture, is that we aren't the human race. We aren't Americans. We aren't people of the 21st century. We are all little categories. I'm black, I'm gay, I'm transgender, I hate President Trump, I love this kind of movies, whatever it is, I'm in a little category. And so we have categories instead of anything that we have in common. There isn't anything that we have in common. That also means that I am very isolated. And isolation is also something that makes us feel anxious. The bottom line is that our culture is extremely narcissistic. So every one of us is the center of our own universe. We're the only thing that's really important in our universe, and we do things that make us feel good or things that make us look good to the people that we think we should look good to. And that lack of connectedness with another person, with some kind of an intimate relationship with a friend or a spouse or family, that's not there. And so it's very easy for us. We're each our own little individual boat on the sea instead of being together in a large ship going to the same place. So, okay, that's just sort of a beginning point of why I think anxiety is the big issue in our culture these days. But let's talk a little bit about where that comes from in the brain, because that's what we're really interested in. The autonomic nervous system is the system that allows our brain to connect our emotional states with physiological responses. If you're anxious, you probably have certain physical things. Oh, my heart's beating too fast. Oh, I can't catch my breath. I'm sweating all the time. I can't sleep. I keep waking up in the middle of the night. All of those things are related to your mood. A person who's calm, who's relaxed, who's feels safe, and who feels cared for and feels like they're a part of something bigger, that person probably sleeps better. They probably digest their food more effectively. They get along better with other people and so forth. So there are two sides to this autonomic nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system is responsible for handling all of these, what we could call maintenance functions of our body. How we sleep is very important, and how well we maintain our health and our immune system. How well we digest. People who have upset stomachs all the time, or who are constipated or have diarrhea, people whose hearts race, or who can't catch their breath. All of those things are related to the autonomic nervous system. So there are two major parts of that. The first part is called the parasympathetic branch. The parasympathetic branch is the part of the autonomic nervous system that's related to maintenance. And you can see all of these various different functions in the body over here. They're all managed by the parasympathetic nervous system. So there are many different centers to the autonomic nervous system on the parasympathetic side. And so it can work when it's time for me to sleep. It can help me to sleep. When it's time for me to eat, it can help me digest my food. When it's time for me to go to the bathroom, it can help me do that. But then there is another side, which is called the sympathetic. And the sympathetic nervous system, you probably know as the fight or flight or freeze system. This is the body's emergency response system. When something dangerous happens, when I feel threatened, or when there is something that is looks like a wonderful opportunity for me, I see a person and I just really, really want to meet that person, my sympathetic nervous system will tend to activate. The activation is done by the adrenal system. So we don't have all of these different centers that are responsible for all of these different functions. We have basically one system which is responsible for controlling our behavior, and that is the adrenaline. That's very reasonable, because we know that in a crisis, we don't have time to have committees. We don't want to sit down and have meetings and then have other meetings and then have other meetings to decide what to do, because the crisis could have overtaken us by then. What we want then is a strong leader that everybody follows and we respond. Maybe it's the best response, maybe it's not, but at least we do something. So those two are different ways that the autonomic system works, and those are basically things that we move back and forth between. There is a way that we would like to see the autonomic nervous system work. First of all, we would be in the parasympathetic mode, in the maintenance mode most of the time, and we'd be able to stay in it for long periods of time, because the parasympathetic mode takes care of the body and maximizes the amount of energy that our body can produce without using a lot of energy. It works specifically on one area, another area, and it performs certain functions, but those functions keep the body working more efficiently. From time to time, we will have experiences where I think this person's following me, or someone gets mad at me, or I get mad at someone else, and we shift into the sympathetic nervous system. We get angry, we get scared, whatever it is. And what we do is we focus our energy not on building new energy, but on using it to respond to a danger or an opportunity. And one of the things that happens during that period is the chemical called cortisol is released into the temporal lobes of our brain, and that activates the temporal lobes, which are very much related to the emotional brain. Ideally, it activates them, and then after the danger passes, after the opportunity passes, we either take advantage of it or we don't. Then we shift back to parasympathetic and we clear the cortisol out of our temporal lobes. So the primary focus of a well-functioning system is that it works with maintaining the body, so the body continues to work for years and years and years and years, fights off disease, takes care of what we need, and so forth. And there are brief expenditures of this kind of emergency response when they're required. But we also know that people get into situations where this is not how it works. If someone sends you into a war zone where there are many other people who would like to kill you, and you are having to kill other people from time to time, all of those things are very traumatic. If you're in a position where you are being traumatized by someone who's doing things to you that you don't want, or people who are not giving you the nurturing and the care that you need to have, then over a period of time, you stay in the fight or flight system for a long period, and you spend less time doing the maintenance functions. So how do we get the decision made whether we're going to be in the maintenance function or in the fight or flight? There are two separate paths that information comes from the outside into our brains. The first one is the one that we use all the time, every day. The information comes up the spinal column about what you saw, what you heard, what you felt, what you smelled, what you touched, and so forth. And it goes to the thalamus. The thalamus then contacts the prefrontal cortex and says, I have this sound, I have this visual. And the prefrontal cortex decides, because it's your executive center, it decides that's important. I want to know more about that, process that. Or it says, no, that's just background noise. I don't need to keep track of that. Block it. Then that information that's not blocked goes to the part of the cortex that are called the association areas in the back, where we have all our memories of everything else we've seen, everything else we've heard, everything else we've touched. And we're able to compare what we're seeing now with everything else that we've seen, and our brain can figure out, okay, that's a face. And in fact, I know that face, that's Pilar's face. So that information then gets sent together. All the things that we hear, all the things that we feel, that we touch, and all of that gets sent to the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex puts it all together and decides, is there something important to me in all of this? And what should I do what should I say, if anything. That path takes a while because it's detailed, it is sophisticated in how it processes information. But there's another path that the same information, what I saw, what I felt, what I heard, goes through. Instead of going through the thalamus in the middle of the brain, it goes through an organ on either side of the brain, just inside the temporal lobes, which is called the amygdala. And the amygdala is basically our smoke alarm, our warning system. Its job is to not to figure out whether the information is important or not to figure out how it fits together, not to figure out how am I going to deal with it. The amygdala simply has to say, this might be dangerous. And as a matter of fact, we don't care if the amygdala is wrong. In most cases, the amygdala might think that something was dangerous, but then when we look at it more closely, we say, oh, no, that wasn't really dangerous at all. But we don't want the amygdala to say it's not dangerous when it really is. So the amygdala is sort of a little bit tuned in to say more things are more dangerous than they appear, because it knows it's got this system also, which is going to be following up and saying, okay, that was a mistake, but at least it was a mistake in the correct direction. So what happens is that when the amygdala says, this looks dangerous, or I think this might be dangerous, the amygdala has the ability to turn on the sympathetic nervous system to move us into that fight or flight state immediately. And when it does that, when the amygdala says, I think that's a snake over there, it might be a poisonous snake, then that news reaches the prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex then says, okay, thalamus, anything that's over there where he thinks he saw a snake, I want to see it. I want to see it in detail, process that in the back of the brain, send me the information so that I can look at that whole picture in more detail and say, no, that's not a snake, that's a stick, or it's a hose, or it's something that looks like it might be a snake, but it's not dangerous. So then the prefrontal cortex turns off the fight or flight response. And then we can go back to parasympathetic, taking care of the maintenance of our bodies. But what happens in some cases, as we said a moment ago, is that the brain can become overly sensitized if it's in a situation where there is a lot of danger, or where it experiences that there's a lot of danger. So I'm going to talk to you for just a second here. This works very well in English, probably not so well in Spanish. SAD is sadness. So the SAD curve is S, A, and D. The first level of moving into that overly activated state is stress. Remember, I said in the beginning that people tell us that we're stressed by our job, we're stressed by our family, we're stressed by, something, whatever it happens to be. But my definition of stress is that stress is not something from the outside. Stress is my response, is something inside of my brain to a situation where I want to have more control than I can have. If I have a good friend or a person that I would really like to get along with, and then I have another person who I really don't care about at all, and then I'm in a situation where I have to do something that they might like or they might not like. If it's the person that I don't really care about, I'm not stressed by that, because whether that person likes me or not is not very important to me. But if it's really a person that I care about and that person doesn't like what I do, then in some sense, I don't have any control of that. That person's going to make their own decision. If I have a child, I want the child to act in a certain way or do certain things, but the child acts in a different way, it's very hard for me to control because the child controls himself, or my spouse controls himself, or my boss controls herself. So in that case, I can be stressed. And when I'm stressed, stress is set up in the amygdala, and the amygdala can turn on the fight, flight, or freeze system, and I'm in sympathetic state. If I do that long enough, if I keep doing it, if the amygdala begins to turn on the fight or flight system for small things, for things that aren't really dangerous, or if I'm in a situation where there is a great deal of danger, then we move from stress to anxiety. Stress is a temporary event. Anxiety is more lasting. So this is an excessive level of ongoing stress, or at least ongoing stress response, that my wife has all of a sudden decided that she doesn't like me anymore. We're still living together. I still care about her, but I can't make her change how she feels about me. I might try that, but I find out soon that it doesn't matter. It's a decision that she makes. So I stay in this stress response, and slowly I start to burn down the amount of capital I have in my energy economy. And also, the longer I stay in this stress state and have it turn into anxiety, instead of having cortisol go into the temporal lobes, help us in the fight or flight situation, and then go out, I keep the levels of cortisol high in my temporal lobes, and cortisol kills neurons. So in the memory center of my brain, the hippocampus, which is in the temporal lobes, and in the emotional part of my brain in the temporal lobes, those begin to burn out because their cortisol doesn't go away. And eventually I get to the D, where I have used up so much energy and I burned up so much of my temporal lobes that I don't have any resources left. And in fact, I may have used up so much adrenaline that I hardly have any adrenaline left. I am in a state called depression, low energy, no resources. The issues of anxiety can be experienced, as I'm sure you've all seen, in terms of physical issues. For many people, these are the things that they notice the most. I can't sleep. My digestion is bad. I have acid reflux or whatever. And the ability to maintain my body suffers as a result of being in that anxiety state. But also it can be emotional, that constant feeling of, I don't think I'll be able to do this. Oh, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if I'll, if the bad things are going to happen, or if I'll be able to deal with them when they do happen. And also there are rebound effects like panic attacks or irritable bowel syndrome, where my bowels are constantly in an uproar. So these are physical, but they're also related to the level of anxiety that I'm experiencing. And it can be intellectual too. My mind can be racing all the time. I can't stop thinking. I can't stop doubting that something is going to happen, that something good is going to happen. So the other thing that happens if we move into an ongoing anxiety state is that because the amygdalas are looking for anxiety or looking for danger so much, those systems become too sensitive and they're triggered very, very easily. So I'm constantly going into fight or flight, and my prefrontal cortex, the part that is the part that actually helps me control my life, is not able to do other things because it spends all of its time responding to these emergency messages from the amygdala going and checking it out and saying, okay, it's not an emergency, turn off the emergency response. And we then end up with that causing depression. So what do we see when we look for anxiety in the brain? The first thing that we can say is that if you are using the trainer's Q, the TQ7 assessment, that essentially goes and looks for patterns that have been identified in research over the last 30 years or more that are connected to anxiety or to inability to pay attention or learning problems or whatever else. So in a case of anxiety, one of the most important things that we see is the right hemisphere of the brain, which is supposed to be the more alpha, the slower hemisphere, the more creative hemisphere, that is faster than the left hemisphere. That's backwards. So the right hemisphere is not doing what it's supposed to do. Instead, it's trying to do what the left hemisphere is supposed to do. And that very strongly connects to anxiety. The front of the brain should be faster than the back. The back should have more alpha than the front. If those things don't happen, then again, we're going to have anxiety when we see this pattern. Alpha is the frequency of stillness, of being present in the moment. If you can't produce alpha, then your mind is always going. You can't be still and you can't relax. You can't get into a place where you're able to just generate maintenance functions. So when alpha is very low, that's very common in people who are anxious. In fact, when you take a drug for anxiety, what it tries to do is artificially increase the amount of alpha that's in the brain. 6 to 8 hertz theta is a frequency that allows us to be in contact with our own subconscious mind. And the subconscious is the center of our memories and the center of our emotions and feelings. So when we don't have 6 to 8 hertz, we're basically cut off from that part of our brain where the memories are and where the feelings are. We don't want to know about them. There's something down there that we want to hide. So that's also very common in anxious people. If we have connectivity, if we have coherence or synchrony that's very high in our fast frequencies, or if we have very low coherence or synchrony in the slow frequencies, in the connectivity page, then that's almost always going to be related to anxiety as well. We're not able to use different parts of our brain independently. So each one is doing its job and sharing information. They're all trying to do the same job at the same time. Or with a low, slow synchrony, we don't have the ability to share information very well, and we don't have the ability to idle, to rest in our brain. The frontal midline is the area like at FZ and CZ, the front half of the line that separates the left and the right. That's an area which is responsible for controlling our emotional responses, controlling how much emotional activation we have. And so if that's very hot, there's a lot of fast activity, or there's a lot of very slow activity, that area doesn't do its job very well. And we experience either we completely block the emotions or we experience them uncontrolled. We can't control them. Temporal lobes are very important, T3, T4, T5, T6. If those are very hot, there's a lot of fast activity, that's almost certainly going to be anxiety. The higher the frequencies of that fast activity, whether it's beta or it's high beta, the hotter they are, the more anxious and the more uncontrolled our amygdala are going to be. Why? Because the amygdala are right inside the temporal lobes. If the amygdala is working very, very hard and finding danger all the time, the temporal lobes are going to show up as being very hot. And oftentimes seems kind of strange, but one of the things that people do when they are very anxious is their brains can learn this strategy of anesthetizing itself. It does that by producing a lot of slow alpha or alpha that doesn't block when you open your eyes or do a task. So it sort of allows the brain to pretend that it's not anxious, but that ends up having a cost later on with things like fibromyalgia, chronic pain, chronic fatigue. Training anxiety, the first thing that I always try to do, there are basically three elements here. The first thing is we need to teach the person about control. We need to teach the person that there are things you cannot control, and trying to control them creates stress. Therefore, you need to be able to ask yourself the question, is this something I can control or not? Can I control whether my boss likes me or not and whether he might fire me? You can try, but the chances are you probably won't be able to. So learning to release that, and that involves to some extent teaching the brain to produce alpha and to learn to get into that stillness state, that helps to reduce the need for control. It's something in the beginning the person has to sort of do consciously, but over time we can teach the brain to do it on its own. So one of my favorite statements, one of the things that I say whenever I feel like something terrible has happened in my life, I say, whatever happens in any given situation is the best thing that could have happened, because I'm not the only person that's there. So it may be something that was very positive for other people. It just wasn't positive for me, but I don't have any control of it. So if I believe this, then I don't worry about controlling it. I do then pay attention to what is the good thing that I can take away from what happened. If I believe that it was just a bad thing, then I'm going to be upset, I'm going to be angry, I'm going to be sad, and good things could be available to me, but I'm not going to look at them and I'm not going to see them. If I'm looking for them, I will find them. If I find them, then I'll be able to turn this into something good. I have many experiences in my life where that has turned out to be true. The second thing is we need to teach the brain how to shift to parasympathetic. There is a kind of breathing, RSA breathing, which we can have the client practice. And that actually, when you do it properly, that moves you from sympathetic, from fight or flight, into parasympathetic. So that breathing is very simple. When you start breathing, you start by breathing out, not by breathing in. And you count up to 7 seconds. And as you're doing that, you're blowing out your air as slowly as you can to see if you can completely empty your lungs in 7 seconds. Then you don't have to breathe in because your lungs are empty. They will draw oxygen back in, and you keep counting. You count 1, 2, 3. Usually the lungs will be filled again in 3. So if you do 7 out, 3 in, let it come in 3. In that kind of breathing, you've slowed yourself down to 1 breath every 7 plus 3, 10 seconds. And if you breathe 6 times a minute, then you will actually shift by activating the vagus nerve, you'll shift yourself into parasympathetic. And I ask clients after they learn to do this to try it during a session and see what happens to their EEG when they do that. But then also to do 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times during a day to practice that 3 minutes. And when you do that, you keep your brain from getting overly stressed and overly anxious because you keep bringing it back down instead of allowing it to keep going up and up and up and up. And over time, your brain learns to breathe more effectively this way, and it makes it possible for it to release the anxiety. But then there are those habit patterns in EEG, too much fast activity on the right, not enough alpha in the back, whatever they are, that stabilize, that turn the anxiety patterns into habits. And our EEG training has to focus on those. So we do the assessment, and the assessment helps us to identify what are those patterns in this person's brain. And then we train to change those patterns using our training protocols. And if we train regularly between 25 and 40 sessions, we can actually teach the brain to release those those patterns and establish new ones. That's what whole brain training is all about. Then there is something which I would say is the step beyond training to reduce anxiety, and that is training peace, training the brain to be able to find peace. So the first thing that we do is we get the person thinking about and aware of the fact that there are many things in your life that you cannot control. By trying to control those things, you're wasting energy, you're creating anxiety in yourself and probably in the other people you're trying to control. So so what we really want to learn is to begin to develop that habit of asking yourself, is this something I can control? Which usually means myself. That's really what I can control. And if it isn't, stop trying to control it. Instead, while you're going through that situation, be aware of it, pay attention to what's going on, pay attention to what that person is doing, saying, feeling, and think about how that might come out and how you might be able to respond to it. I'm doing that right now. We moved to the United States from Brazil last June, and we moved to a place in the middle of the city. We've been thinking that it would be a really good idea to move out of the city, but it's not possible for us to do it now. There are certain things that have to change to make that possible that we can't control. So at least we can be looking at options. Where are good places if we decided to move? How much is it going to cost? You know, all of those kinds of things. The second thing is, if you want to develop peace in your brain, don't try to control things you can't control, but wait until the water clears. Wait until all the turmoil that you can't control has ended and things have stabilized a little bit. Then use the energy that you saved to make your response. You prepared to move because you already thought about how it would work. Does it really make sense or not? And you also then have thought about whether, well, even though it seemed like I should move, I shouldn't stay, it does look like staying makes more sense, so that I'm ready when I can exert control. The third thing is control yourself. Don't try to control others. That's the thing that most of us don't like to do because controlling ourselves is hard. But that's one of the things that as you train, you actually learn to change the way your brain works so that you are able to control yourself. You're able to change those habits that other people thought of as pathologies, you believe are habits. And then trust, have faith that you will always be able to find opportunities in whatever situation you encounter, no matter what happens to you, no matter what terrible things you think are occurring in your life. If you look for the opportunities in those situations, you'll find them. You might not find them right away. It might take a little while, but you will find them. And because you haven't wasted the energy and because you've looked at the possible outcomes, when you find the opportunity, you're ready to move. You have the energy to make changes, and you already got some ideas about what changes you'd like to see. Alpha theta training is very, very important because it allows us to connect ourselves, our conscious minds, our egos with the subconscious, our feelings, our memories, and our creativity. And it allows us then to apply the creativity and the intuition, those very powerful tools, to the things that we need to do and want to do. Default mode network training of FZ and PZ. If you're using the training plan, that whole brain training plan, this is in block 4. That allows you to know yourself from the inside and to control yourself and to change yourself more effectively. So, sorry, I went a little bit long there. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Thank you, Peter. We have a question, Peter. Marisa, please.
Peter, Marta is asking, could anxiety be hiding some other illness or pathology?
Again, I would say I wouldn't call it a pathology, but anxiety, one of the reasons it's so important to identify it in the brain, if it's there, is that it is underneath many other things. So you may have a child that parents bring to you and say, oh, this child has attention deficit, this child can't control himself, and so you decide, oh, I'll train to reduce theta and increase beta. But if a person is anxious, if a person has, let's say, a history of trauma, and that person is very anxious, do you believe that person will be able to pay attention in school or at work? Not very well, because the anxiety underlying their way that they think, their mind is always racing. They're always worried about the future is going to hold, whether they'll be able to fail or succeed on something. So that can be an issue. Even problems with memory. If a person is a brain which has basically got a foundation which is very anxious, they're going to have trouble paying attention. And if they have trouble paying attention, they'll have trouble remembering. They'll have trouble dealing with other people. They'll have trouble forming relationships with other people because they're always looking for that person to leave me or to do something bad to me. So they block the ability to connect other things. Depression certainly is underlying anxiety. Anxiety leads us to depression. So if you want to consider that all of the things that we're talking about are pathologies, you can do that. But the difficulty is that if you consider them pathologies, when you're sick, you're stuck. You can't do anything about it. So you have to go to somebody else. You are powerless if you're sick. If I get the coronavirus, what can I do about it? I have to go to the doctor. The doctor says, well, let's do this. Let's try that. Let's try that. I'm helpless. But if it's a habit, if we say depression is a habitual way that my brain deals with the world, it sees the negative, it doesn't see the positive, it expects there to be negative things happening all the time, and it has very little energy. You can call that a pathology, but you could also say that's a habitual way that my brain responds. The same thing is true with anxiety. The same thing is true with impulse control or with obsessive compulsive or any of those things. But if it's a habit, that changes everything. Because if it's a habit, there's only one person in the world who can change my habits. It's me. And if I can change it, and if I have someone help me to learn how to change it by using brain training and by helping me to learn how to change those habits in my brain that are set up in the electricity in my brain, then I now have power. I have actually changed my own brain. I've changed my own life. And the things that always just happened, I always just saw the negative. Now I don't. Now I see the positives in situations. I always tried to control things I couldn't control. Now I recognize this is something where I have to wait and watch and be ready to move, because I cannot change how my boss feels about me. So yes, I would say that if you've studied the brain trainer system, you might have seen the courses on tone. And autonomic tone is a measure of how much the emotional brain is driving, how much we are in the anxiety state or the stress state or the depression state. And we always train tone first. We have to work on the tone issues. We have to break up those emotional habit patterns so that the brain can be able to function more efficiently in all of the other ways.
Peter, thank you. Thank you for your time, for the information.
Okay,
a todos,
my pleasure. Excuse me?
A todos, muchísimas gracias. Yes. A todos, muchísimas gracias por su participación. Nos pasamos unos minutos, pero el tema estaba muy interesante para todos. Quienes estén interesados en saber más sobre neurofeedback, sobre cómo podemos apoyar con temas de ansiedad, pueden contactarnos al correo ceidd.braintrainer@protraccion.com. Lo encuentran en el chat, ahí aparece escrito el correo al cual pueden contactarnos para saber más sobre neurofeedback, sobre el entrenamiento cerebral. A todos muchísimas gracias, les deseamos feliz noche.